Hello, everyone. So I've been around this field a long time and involved with SNAG for 40 years. It's been so long that the conversations with my friends have gone from talking about smoking joints to talking about replacing joints. Thank you to Vera. I also like to thank Susan Grant-Lewin and curator Ursula S. Newman for writing the letters of nomination for Thomas Gentille, as well as our third committee member, Sebastian Grant, who you'll see in a minute. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep this like me, short and sweet. And following my part, you will see 4 videos about Thomas by his dear friends, collector Susan Grant-Lewin, curator, historian, and author Tony Greenbaum, curator of the Munich Pinakothek de Moderne, Petra Holscher, and renowned jeweler Kif Slemons. They would detail Thomas's extraordinary career and help you understand who he was and how much he contributed to the field we all love. Thomas and I were friends for more than 30 years. As chair of the committee in 2005, when he was selected, I had the privilege of calling him to tell him he was receiving this honor. He was genuinely thrilled and even a little bit giddy, not something you saw from Thomas very often. I only wish he was here to receive it in person. I'm sure he would have really loved that. In this age of artificial intelligence and digital technology, Thomas Gentille was a passionately analog man who embraced and thrived using the original digital, his fingers. He loved using his hands to create innovative jewelry that was relentlessly evolving over 5 decades. He deeply explored an endless list of materials with sensitivity and paramount skill. He was one of the most focused and dedicated people I've ever known, full of opinions that were as clear as the jewelry he made. I will miss him and our long, intelligent conversations. Thomas received his BFA in painting from the CIA. That's Cleveland Institute of Art, not the Central Intelligence Agency. And his last semester there, he needed one more elective to graduate, and by chance, he decided on a jewelry class. As it turned out, that random choice was a fork in the road of his life. He told me that the first time he put a saw blade into a jeweler's saw and plucked it, as we do, that it was love at first. We all know the feeling. He said that he felt like, unlike painting, jewelry would fight him. I love that sentiment. He was a more than worthy adversary. So after a competition, as Devera mentioned, the Lifetime Achievement Award Committee selected Stephen Yusko to design and make the new award. Stephen, can you stand up? And they're up here on stage. I encourage you to have a closer look when we're done. Following the videos, and Thomas's award will go to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, along with his papers. Following the videos, Sebastian Grant, the incoming chair of the committee, will MC the presentation to Joyce Scott. Thanks.
Thomas and I were friends for over 40 years, and he called me the other TG, Tony Greenbaum, Thomas Gentille. 3 words that best describe his aesthetic to me are purity, precision, and process. Thomas's main focus was brooches, which he referred to as pins, probably because the surface plane of the pin offered the best opportunity for the painterly and or sculptural qualities of reliefs, along with allowing him to experiment with atypical materials for jewelry. What you see on the screen is not a Thomas Gentille brooch. It's actually a painted wood sculpture, Valley Forge from 1963 by Anne Truitt, who in fact Thomas told me did influence his aesthetic to a certain degree. Now, this is a Thomas Gentille pin made from pumice, paint, and zinc, not a Thomas Gentille brooch. An Anne Truitt painted wood sculpture, Night's Vision from 1963, and a Thomas Gentille brooch, clearly informed by Anne Truitt's aesthetic. Actually, I should say a Thomas Gentille pin, because he would take great issue with me if I called these brooches. This piece is maple wood, cherry wood, pigmented resin, and sawdust. And sawdust, of course, being one of the atypical materials that Thomas would use for his pin. This pin is mahogany, cherry wood, maple wood, pigmented resin, and metal. And he used different woods. Thomas loved woods and would often use different woods with other materials. Here, this very, very painterly pigmented resin. Plywood, exotic wood, and air. And there's only one other jewelry artist that used air as an actual material in his pieces, and that was Art Smith. I've never heard of anyone else using air as a material in listing the materials of their jewelry works. This piece too, cherry wood, beech wood, plywood, and air. This pin by Thomas is wood and paint. Thomas would often paint the wooden pieces. And again, just to remind you of Anne Truitt's reliefs, if you didn't really know the scale of these pins of Thomas's that were showing, you would think that they were monumental sculptures in the photographs. But Thomas was adamant about making pieces that would relate to the human body in scale and that were wearable. Another piece of wood and paint, a bit more dimensional than the one prior, wood and pigment. And then in this back view, you can see the pigment also just around the edges. And the way Thomas was absolutely as perfectionistic about the backs of his pins as he was about the front. This piece is wood, pumice, and pure pigment. And Thomas loved to use pure pigment. That cobalt blue or ultramarine blue or Eve Klein blue was one of my favorite colors. And Thomas once gave me, I remember, a small jar of just the pure pigment of that wonderful cobalt blue that he would rub into the pumice on this particular brooch and juxtapose it with that smooth, smooth wood. And that is a side view of that brooch. Really, the side views and the back views of these pieces in almost all instances are as beautiful and as well thought out as the front of the pieces, and completely different, always a surprise element. One of the materials that Thomas excelled at was eggshell inlay. It is a very arduous and time-consuming material to work with. He never shared his particular process. It's a process that was used in Asia, historically used in France during the Art Deco period. Many makers used eggshell inlay, but always slightly differently. Thomas would rub pure pigment into those interstices between those teeny, teeny bits of eggshell. He used all sorts of bird's eggs. And in this marvelous brooch, he has surfaced the piece with ivory, probably cut from old piano keys, and then anchored it with those steel rivets. This piece is an extraordinary example of Thomas's use of eggshell inlay. You can really see the different sizes of the eggs that he has broken up. again, that he has placed on the surface of this pin with his own methodology, and then rubbed pigment, pure pigment, into the interstices between all of the bits, the black on the top and the blue on the bottom. Thomas also used aluminum. He loved the material, and some of his simplest but really most exciting pieces were made from aluminum. This piece is as simple as it gets, just with that thin vertical line, but nonetheless beautiful. That piece is aluminum also, with steel bolts. And in certain instances, he would hammer the aluminum. So the portion on the left, he hammered and juxtaposed with the portions on the right, which are relatively flat. And this is one of my favorite pins by Thomas. This is a photograph that he took while walking out of the subway station of the back of this woman's legs who was walking up the steps in front of him. And what he was fascinated by, he told me, were the lines, those lines in her pantyhose, the seams in her pantyhose or stockings, which he thought were just fascinating. And that piece is a photograph that he mounted in cherry wood and covered with acrylic. The cherry wood has been painted, and then it's been bolted together with steel bolts. And I think that that piece was a very good piece to end with, a fitting close to my brief tribute to Thomas.
Ladies and gentlemen, exactly 10 years ago, in March 2016, Die Neue Sammlung presented Thomas Gentille as the first and to date only US studio jewelry artist under the glass roof of Munich's Pinakothek der Moderne, a place dedicated only to the masters of modern jewelry. The former press text has lost none of its topic, quotation marks. To mark his 80th birthday in 2016, Die Neue Sammlung has decided to invite one of the initiators of studio jewelry in America. Thomas Gentille is one of the first American studio jewelry artists to employ non-precious materials consistently. He has done so from 1960 onwards, calling into question the value of precious metals in how jewelry is designed and estimated. For Thomas Gentille, the emphasis is always irrevocably on the piece itself, its artistic statement and its quality. Quotation marks. It all began in 1989. Thomas was one of the selection of US studio jewelry artists who gallerist Helen Williams Strutt had proposed for the jewelry show at Munich International Crafts Fairs. In 1999, Olga Zobel presented Thomas in her gallery Biro. Munich's Danner Foundation acquired 2 of Thomas' works. The year 2001 marks the next stop on our Munich timeline. The then jury members Rüdiger Jupin, curator at Hamburg's Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe, Mayam Unger, Dutch art critic and much noted jewelry expert, and Thomas' birthday brother Peter Skubitz all voted in favor of awarding Thomas the well-known Herbert Hoffmann Prize. 2004 was a highly eventful year for all of us. Thomas was awarded the Bavarian State Prize, a special honor that had until then only been granted on one other American, Arlene Fish, back in 1971. And in 2004, the Danner Foundation and Die Neue Sammlung jointly opened the jewelry space in Pinakothek der Moderne, better known as the Danner Rotunde. Thomas was one of the over 2,000 guests at the opening. In our purple jewelry book, he wrote, quotation marks, "We each have moments that give us a great pleasure to remember. The opening of the Danner Rotunde is one of mine. It makes me thrill each and every time I think of that evening. I think of it often." Quotation marks. In 2006, he was the first jewelry studio jewelry artist to be honored at the Schmuck as a Klassiker der Moderne for his life's work at the time. 35 of his pieces went on display. Ursula Ilse Neumann recollects in an interview with Thomas that it was these works, quotation marks, which then really provoked the American Craft Museum to bring the entire Schmuck show over to this country. And Thomas added, I was very lucky to have been Klassiker der Moderne that year. My first one-person exhibition in the Museum of Decorative Arts was there because of that, quotation marks. In 2009, Thomas sitting opposite to the then director of Die Neue Sammlung, Florian Hufnagel, in the latter's office. Thomas placed two differently sized little boxes on the museum's director's desk. He first opened the smaller box. It contained one of Thomas' marvelous aluminum brooches. He then opened the larger box and carefully extracted one of his enchanting armlets made of plastic in different orange and gray tones from the packaging. And in 2009, Thomas left his beloved black reading glasses with a particularly small lens somewhere in Munich and was not able to track them down. Hufnagel simply gave him one of his own personal reading glasses. A moment of that Thomas talked nearly every time we've met. In 2011, Florian Hufnagel invited Thomas for a tour of the Peter Skubitz exhibition, knowing full well that a birthday brother wanted to really view the exhibition of another birthday brother. In 2015, and on the occasion of our Sunday matinee, Toni Greenbaum held her unforgettable lecture on From MAG to SNAG in the Ernst von Siemens Auditory at Pinakothek der Moderne, which gave us an initial idea of the history of US jewelry. Needless to say, Thomas was there. At that time, neither Thomas nor I could have guessed that we would soon be in ever closer contact. Among other things, thanks to the good talks with Bettina Dittelmann and Michael Young, who were very close friends of Thomas, in June 2015, I cautiously approached him to ask whether he could imagine presenting an exhibition on his oeuvre at Die Neue Sammlung. As we now all know, his answer was yes. March 2016. During the setting up of his exhibition, those were moments of happiness, watching him and analyzing how he placed his objects in the display cases, enjoying the short breaks over a good espresso in the afternoon or a plate of gnocchi in the evening at our shared favorite Italian. Thanks to Thomas, I got an idea of which other American artists were important and needed to be included in our collection. In part, he immediately put his idea into practice. One evening, while setting up the show, he asked me whether he could make a phone call. He wanted to call the States, and that meant the call would be more expensive, but he really needed to phone a close friend. I didn't know that the close friend was Kif Slemons. By the end of the call, he had convinced Kif Slemons to give Die Neue Sammlung the small toolbox titled Overruled, filled with rings. We and I are still very grateful to Thomas for his unbelievable idea and to Kif Slemons for her trusting generosity and faith in the museum's work. Thomas loved Munich, and Munich loved Thomas. His unconditional loyalty to Die Neue Sammlung was characterized by a deep bond to the museum, its former director, and to me down through the years. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a great honor for me as a representative of Die Neue Sammlung to be invited to address you here on the occasion of Thomas Gentille being posthumously granted the Lifetime Achievement Award at the SNAG Conference 2026, and I would like to most cordially thank the organizers for the opportunity, namely Brienne Rosner, Davira Taragin, and, of course, Susan Grant-Lewin. Thank you.
Thomas Gentille lived in Manhattan for almost 50 years. No cell phone, no car, no elevator, no meat, and no hurry. He was alone, but he was never lonely. He was his own best friend. He had a rich and curious mind. He didn't care about money. He looked like $1,000,000, but he could only afford H&M and Uniqlo. He had an eye to put great outfits together. He'd rather donate a work of jewelry to an important museum than sell it. Selling his work meant very little to him. The joy was making it. Toward the end of his life, I asked him to deal with some important details. No, he said, I'm going to spend my final days drawing and making. Drawing was his passion. He was extremely proud and secretive about his discovery of making eggshell inlay. It took him years to develop the technique. I specifically asked him if he would share his secret formula with other jewelers when he was gone. He said, no, it goes to the grave with me. He was a poet and an excellent writer. Friends saved his handwritten correspondence, lovely notes that showed he genuinely cared, and they were all in his beautiful handwriting. He wrote this: after 3 years of tough and joyous work, in the summer of 2001, shortly before the disaster of 9/11, I completed a 33-page poem based on the Greek legend of Orpheus and Eurydice. In addition, he wrote several volumes of short poems. He also loved to make films. Among his best films, a fashion jewelry show held in the Munich subway station, and an Artsmith mid-century exhibition at the former 50/50 Gallery in Manhattan. He loved Manhattan. He loved people watching, sketching, writing short stories about the people he encountered in the parks. He also loved Munich, the city that honored him with a one-man show at the Design Museum. When we wandered around the city, he would say to me, follow the tram tracks. He called himself a film buff. He had a gigantic collection of old films, which he loved to watch. Greta Garbo, Barbara Stanwyck, Fred McMurray, Rosalind Russell, Fred and Ginger. These movie stars fascinated him. He loved watching their old films and had a vast collection. And he never missed an episode of iTunes about a young couple renovating a chateau in France. Another of his favorites was Dancing with the Stars. He never missed it. Friends knew not to call him Monday nights because he would be watching Dancing with the Stars. I wondered, did his love of dancing grow out of his early years studying tap dancing? We found his old tap shoes in his apartment. Opera was important to him. His total favorite was Turandot, but hands down, his favorite aria was the Queen of the Night from the Magic Flute. In the Loop catalog titled Color, Light, Air, he talked about jewelry. The book opens with a quote from Aristotle: the hand is the tool of tools. His second favorite tool, his fingernails. He went on about why they should not be too long, should not be too short. They had to be just right so they could handle the tiny bolts that helped him make his jewelry. Thomas loved to cook. He had his favorite recipes, which he would regale us over the telephone. They always included shortcuts. He was very into health food, and he was a vegetarian. When I had a show of my large jewelry collection in Savannah, he was invited to speak to the students. I used to kid him that he ruined my trip to Savannah because we had to turn down all the wonderful dinners at Savannah's famous gourmet restaurants that we were invited to. He would not eat these rich sauces and heavy foods. We had to eat in health food restaurants. He was also passionate about espresso. When he became ill, he had to limit himself to one a day. That was very upsetting, as he had his favorite barista where he would love to go. It was the best espresso shop in New York City. Making drawings about jewelry was his passion. A drawing a day, he would say. No wonder we have thousands of magnificent drawings and sketchbooks of his work. He would make 6 or 7 detailed drawings about each brooch. He truly deserves SNAG's Lifetime Achievement Award. He dedicated his life to jewelry.
These flowers are for you, Thomas. Thomas Gentille built small, perfect worlds. Self-contained, their surfaces are created through intense investigations into what unexpected materials might offer up. In a sense, he made shelters from the messy, larger world where we often find ourselves. Not previously knowing his work, a jeweler cabinet maker friend recently admired one of Thomas's pins, and after carefully examining the piece from different angles, announced, "Oh, he's an architect." Clearly, what he saw was the clarity of form, the detailed fittings, the precision of construction, the deep material surfaces. In short, an object sure of itself. The word superficial is often used as a derogatory term to describe shallowness, the outside surface of something, for instance. But the surfaces of Thomas's work are dense, substantial. Thomas found value in lifting up the quotidian nature of materials, what he calls their souls. His was a collaborative effort, although he was the epitome of the solitary artist in the studio. Thomas's jewelry is pristine, and for me, sometimes almost too perfect. However, I always respect the integrity of his work, the trust in his hand, the mind in his hand. He surrounded himself with all manner of wondrous things in his apartment studio of 40 years that were, I would say, his companions, that helped him lead his creative life. He was generous in his teaching and in his friendships. Thomas and I talked shop over 30 years, at first through writing, then in more recent years through regular phone calls. That rhythm I deeply miss. He spoke of mastery and permanence, in contrast to my approach, avoiding the pitfall of style, the masterpiece mode, and perfect conclusions. He advocated for attention to expanded categories and context when considering jewelry as an art form, not falling into what now we might call a brand. He was not a minimalist or one working in pure abstraction, defining these designations more specifically. Nor was I simply a jeweler with found objects or a narrative jeweler, a term I found particularly inaccurate. Ideas and the language surrounding my materials were inherent in our approach to jewelry, both declarative and metaphoric. We also discussed the issue of dating our work when so much emphasis in the art world is on the new, where galleries were averse to showing work no older than 2 years, for instance, as though newer is always better. Thomas and I agreed that when we are working with ideas, developing our expressions of them, we can creatively return to second and third looks, or even circle back to the beginning to show them better for the first time. Affixing a date on a work may say nothing about the creation of the piece at all. In 1957, when Thomas began working with non-traditional materials, the term alternate materials did not even exist, though that was the direction he had taken on his own, one of the first to do so. He was not talking about the use of found object composed of, for instance, glass or wood, but the use of basic alternative substances that had not been previously made into an object, i.e. a piece of jewelry. To quote Thomas in an interview with Petra Holscher, Bettina Dittelman, and Michael Jagg, "What I find is the natural materials show you what I call their soul very easily, and the synthetics do not. They hide it. So working with the synthetics, it's harder to find out what the soul of that material is and how to use that material properly." He goes on to say, "I am always trying to work out how to treat the material in the best way possible, so it will give you its best result, and its best result is its soul. A very simple example would be if I were polishing something on the buffing wheel. I may be able to get a really beautiful finish, thinking that's what I want. But if I do the same thing by hand, there will be a slight difference in the finish, and that difference makes all the difference in the world. So that thing you are polishing is saying, well, it's okay if you use me on the buffing wheel, I'll give you a nice thing. But if you do a little bit of manual work on here, I respond to it in a different way." And that's what I like to discover when working with the material, how that little change in the way you handle it makes the material give something of itself that it normally doesn't give. The challenge of finding what that will do is something I find exciting. Only more recently, in one of my last visits with Thomas in his apartment, did I learn and explore his drawings. There are hundreds of them, and they are thrilling to discover. I felt the soul of Thomas there, right there on the page. I'm grateful he witnessed my response as I examined them, for he agreed to their being shown. Most of the drawings are signed and dated. One wonders, what does this say in contrast to his position on dating his jewelry? Yes, Thomas was a jeweler, but he was also an artist, an architect, a dancer, a poet. In all these sides of him, there was clarity and well-defined edges. However, his clarity was not without mystery, and in so many instances when we think we know someone so well, there can be mysteries which sustain the relationship. Within his modest means, Thomas lived a thoroughly aesthetic life in his work, in his clothing, in his moss garden in Central Park, in the arrangements in his home and studio, in his weekly visits to the Metropolitan Museum, and his travels throughout the city. His chosen solitary life made this possible. In one of the last emails I received from Thomas, he lamented having to leave his apartment to move to a care facility in the Bronx. He wrote, "The rooms are large, but hideously furnished. Perhaps they will let me bring my Noguchi table, and surely my little white Braun travel alarm clock, and some white linen drapes for the window. Their drapes themselves could speed up my departure, like making a vegetarian eat a side of beef. Don't laugh, it's not funny." Then adding a slight demonic giggle on my part. That was Thomas, clear and in mind and eye to the end.